I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
The United States of America shares an array of values with the United Kingdom: freedom, democracy, respect. However, the UK has one major difference to its American cousin: the monarchy. Presidents have come and gone for hundreds of years, with each political party fighting it out for a place at the White House. And yet, the British monarchy has remained a constant. But what happens when one of the world's most powerful political leaders meets one of the world's most powerful families? This is When the Windsors Met the Reagans.
The British and American people are as close today as two peoples have ever been. We see you as our strong and trusted friend, and we believe that you in turn will find us as ready as ever to bear our full share in defending the values in which we both believe.
The British royal family has always been key to building and maintaining friendly relations between the United States and the United Kingdom. Unlike the U.S. president, the British sovereign always remains non-political.
You, Richard Milhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear.
I, Richard Milhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully execute the office
that I will faithfully execute the office
of President of the United States.
Of President of the United States.
King George VI began the tradition of meeting U.S. presidents in 1939, only a few months before the start of World War II. President Franklin D. Roosevelt invited George VI for a visit to the United States, and the event soon held much significance. Until then, no reigning British monarch had ever set foot on American soil, not even in colonial times. George VI's heir and daughter, the late Queen Elizabeth II, continued the tradition and met a record 13 U.S. presidents during her reign.
In memory of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who in death my people still mourn, and whom in life they loved and admired.
Some meetings went better than others over the years. In 1977, Jimmy Carter famously kissed the Queen Mother. More recently, Donald Trump broke royal protocol by walking in front of Her Majesty during an inspection of the Royal Guard. Queen Elizabeth II watched history unfold with every new U.S. president. Ronald Reagan's early life differed from the privileged childhoods of many other presidents. Reagan was born on 6th of February 1911 in a commercial building in Tampico, Illinois.
His family actually moved around a lot when he was younger because his father was a shoe salesman, but eventually they settled, and he grew up very, very poor. In fact, he didn't even have access to running water when he was a child. His father was an alcoholic and quite a difficult person, but he got along really well with his mother, who was considered to be really sweet and generous.
Both his mother and father therefore influenced Reagan's politics and beliefs. Once the family settled in the town of Dixon, Reagan attended Dixon High School, where he developed his interests in drama and football. Reagan would go on to attend Eureka College, where he threw himself into sports, drama, and campus politics societies. However, he struggled to excel at his economic and sociology degree and remained a fairly mediocre student throughout his years at college. His role after college as a sports announcer for the Chicago Cubs eventually led him to a screen test with Warner Brothers Studio. Reagan impressed producers and successfully landed a 7-year contract with the film studio. His acting career swiftly began.
Well, Jack Curtiz in person.
That's the trouble with you actors, Ronnie. No appreciation for what we directors do to make you look good.
Oh, Morgan would love to hear you say that.
In 1938, Reagan starred in Brother Rat alongside fellow actress Jane Wyman. The show business pair hit it off, and they married 2 years later in California. Jane and Ronald had 3 children, Maureen, Michael, and 1-day-old Christine, who died shortly after birth. Unfortunately, the marriage broke down, and the acting couple divorced in 1949. 3 years later, Reagan married another actress, Nancy Davis.
Not long after, he would meet the actress Nancy Davis. Nancy Davis got in touch with him because he was president of the Screen Actors Guild, and she was worried that her name had been on a list of communist sympathizers, and he helped get her name off that list because there was another Nancy Davis who was active in that role. So they would then go on to marry in 1952 and have 2 children, Patricia and Ronald Reagan Jr.
Without realizing it, Nancy Reagan would one day become one of the most influential first ladies in American history. Reagan's time as president of the Screen Actors Guild proved tumultuous and tense. In the late 1940s and 50s, America drove a nationwide persecution of communists and suspected sympathizers. Soon, the age of McCarthyism and anti-communist sentiment seeped into Hollywood. In 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee interrogated actors, writers, and other creatives with communist ties. Lists of suspected communists were released in newspapers. The persecuted lost their jobs and were blacklisted in Hollywood.
The question before this committee and the scope of its present inquiry will be to determine the extent of communist infiltration in the Hollywood motion picture industry.
I never, as a citizen, want to see our country become so, or become urged by either fear or resentment of this group that we ever compromise with any of our democratic principles through that fear or resentment.
He was suspicious that many members of Hollywood were members of the Communist Party. And so in the end, he would cooperate with the FBI and in fact agreed to testify before the House of Un-American Activities and would designate several members of Hollywood as communist sympathizers.
Reagan's experience as president of the Screen Actors Guild changed his political views forever.
By 1962, he officially declared that he wasn't really any part of the Democratic Party anymore. He famously stated, "I didn't leave the Democratic Party, they left me."
In 1966, Reagan ran in the election for governor of California. He campaigned on the key issues of individual freedom and small government and appealed to many voters through his television speeches.
Listen, I know that you've already met the members of our team and your new senatorial candidate, Bob Stevens. And I think it's wonderful that Chuck Connors would come along because the manner in which the other team has been campaigning, it's time that some people were reminded that actors are people.
Reagan defeated his opponent, Pat Brown, to become governor of California from 1967 to 1971. He was re-elected again for a second term in 1971 after defeating Jesse M. Ura with 52.85% of the vote.
By 1968, Ronald Reagan had become a very popular California governor, and he was such a star in the Republican Party that he started to feel that he could make a bigger impact by running for the big office, for president.
His popularity as governor of California pushed Reagan towards running for president. Reagan ran in the primaries in 1976, but proved unsuccessful as Gerald Ford narrowly won the Republican nomination.
Jerry Ford, why are you asking your fellow Americans and your fellow Michiganders to let you go on being president for the next 4 years? My answer is very simple. Because I've done a good job. I'm proud of it.
1980 turned out to be a very different story for Reagan. The 69-year-old Republican won the eyes and ears of voters. He was soon on track to become the 40th president of the United States. In 1980, Ronald Reagan's dream of reaching the highest office in the land came true. Reagan won a decisive victory, claiming 44 states and 489 electoral votes. His Democrat opponent, Jimmy Carter, lost re-election in a landslide defeat. The Reagan era came crashing through the doors of the White House, and nothing could stand in its way.
Reagan was able to win such a landslide against Carter because of the state of the economy in the US. At the time, there was incredible inflation, there wasn't much economic growth, there was a lot of despair about the direction that the economy was going in, and that was coupled with the perception that Jimmy Carter was ineffective in foreign policy. And so Reagan came in his plain-speaking, affable way, communicating to the public, and he was known as the great communicator. And he was able to really resonate that he could make a difference.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
At the time of his election, America's economy was in tatters. Carter's unpopularity and poor economic performance opened up an opportunity for Reagan to inspire new hope. And he used his inaugural address to promote small government policies.
Reagan spoke about the U.S. as a country that had great potential, and he tried to communicate this idea that individuals have the power to create their own destiny, and that the individual could achieve great things.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Only 2 months into his first term, Reagan faced an attack on his life.
There has been an assassination attempt on President Reagan. The president has been hit.
John Hinckley Jr. fired 6 times at the president. Bullets struck Press Secretary James Brady, Police Officer Thomas Delante, and Secret Service Agent Tim McCarty. Whilst escaping the scene in the president's limousine, Secret Service agents and staff noticed blood coming from Reagan's mouth. Hinckley had shot the 40th president in the lung. The president recovered in a local hospital and luckily survived what could have been a fatal gunshot wound. As the event made headlines, Reagan's popularity ratings soared. On a popularity high, Reagan stepped up the heat in tackling the economic mess. Ronald Reagan developed a set of neoliberal reforms named Reaganomics, which pushed for lower taxes, deregulation, and free trade.
Yesterday, as you know, I had an opportunity to meet with the nation's governors, and they all recognized that this program will require some belt-tightening, but many of them also agreed that only if our government grows less will our economy grow more.
Reagan is known for Reaganomics, which was this economic strategy or set of policies that included trying to encourage economic growth, trying to curtail inflation, cutting taxes, cutting social spending, but increasing defense spending.
However, Reagan's reforms more greatly benefited the rich rather than those at the bottom of the economic ladder. The economic policies also targeted social and welfare programs, leaving many Americans financially desperate and plunging deeper into poverty.
Because Reagan believed that government was the problem and that it was really impeding on the spirit of the individual, you saw there was not just huge tax cuts, but also huge cuts in government regulations. And that really allowed the banks to do whatever they wanted to do. And they ran amok with all kinds of loans, sometimes very high-risk loans that we had never really seen in the US before. The other thing is that Reagan engaged in huge cuts in social spending. 22 billion was actually cut. And in particular, he was going after programs that supported the poor. This meant support for food stamps, support for low-income housing. In fact, housing was probably the area that he honed in on the most. And this would, of course, lead to 1 million people becoming homeless because they didn't have the support coming from the government.
Reaganomics did show a level of success in some areas. Reagan ultimately stopped the economy from spiraling out of control and influenced future political leaders to adopt a similar strategy. The 40th president not only faced huge problems at home. In the early 1980s, tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union increased. Reagan urgently needed to tackle the overseas challenges head-on. The 45-year standoff between the U.S. and the USSR started at the end of World War II. Soon after the surrender of Nazi Germany in May 1945, the rocky alliance between the U.S. and the Soviet Union began to unravel.
If history teaches anything, it teaches that simple-minded appeasement or wishful thinking about our adversaries is folly. It means the betrayal of our past, the squandering of our freedom. To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil.
By 1948, the Soviet Union had installed left-wing governments in Eastern European countries. America and Britain soon feared Soviet domination of Eastern Europe and the spread of communism in the West. In retaliation, the U.S. sought to provide aid to Western European countries and place them under American influence. The Soviet Union also developed their own nuclear weapons, ending the American monopoly on the atomic bomb. These actions sent the world into a state of paranoia. People began building bomb shelters. The U.S. government launched nuclear safety adverts on the television, and children practiced drills in school. A dark shadow spread across the world.
These children are practicing to duck and cover just as you do in your school. We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous. Since it may be used against us, we must get ready for it, just as we are ready for many other dangers that are around us all the time.
In 1961, the Iron Curtain in Europe took on a physical form. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev ordered East German soldiers to build a wall and close off access between East and West Berlin. The wall soon became the ultimate symbol of oppression. When Reagan became president, he made it his primary mission to create peace through strength.
Ronald Reagan was suspicious of the Soviet Union for decades. He didn't believe any of the president's were taking a strong enough stance, in particular Jimmy Carter. He disagreed with détente. He disagreed with containment. He wanted to force the Soviet Union to its knees by outspending it in military defense. Defense spending more than doubled. And this was at a time that the Soviet Union was already spending up to 15% of its own GDP on military spending. And so he was able to push the Soviet Union into an arms race that it couldn't really handle.
However, by 1985, the world was shifting. Mikhail Gorbachev took over as leader of the Soviet Union and soon became one of the most significant figures of the 20th century. Gorbachev led a mission to rebuild the economy, improve living standards in Soviet Union countries, and promote openness and freedom of expression. Reagan was a staunch anti-communist, but in Gorbachev, he found a Soviet leader the U.S. could finally negotiate with.
Gorbachev was a different type of leader. He was one that really recognized the trade-offs that the Soviet Union faced and that it could no longer really survive if it continued to both support all of the Eastern European countries that were part of its bloc and subsidize them, while also pursuing a military spending strategy that was just completely unsustainable.
1987 became a particularly important year for peacemaking. In a visit to West Berlin, Ronald Reagan gave one of his most powerful speeches. The moment inspired hope across a divided nation.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The same year, Reagan and Gorbachev also signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, agreeing to eliminate a weapons class and reduce their nuclear weapons stockpiles. An historic and profound moment on both sides. Despite critical debate, Ronald Reagan's strength, courage, and prophetic speeches helped push the world towards closing the door on the Cold War.
We have listened to the wisdom in an old Russian maxim, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. Mr. General Secretary, though my pronunciation may give you difficulty, the maxim is, doверяй, но проверяй. Trust but verify.
Но значение этого...
На каждой встрече вы это повторяете.
You repeat that at every meeting.
The end of Ronald Reagan's presidency showcased huge changes in American society. Inequality was rife, and national debt had tripled. Reagan's politics changed conservatism in America forever. His administration therefore became one of the most significant in U.S. history.
When Reagan left office in 1989, the U.S. was changed forever. I mean, one of the biggest changes was the fact that the U.S., ideologically speaking, had moved to the right. Conservatism had been revived. The moderates in the Republican Party had all moved to the right and had been infiltrated by the Christian right in particular. And so you saw that there was nonstop bashing of the government. It became commonplace that people didn't feel that the government could do much for you and that we needed to get the government more and more out of people's daily lives.
The 40th president's optimism, humor, and ability to put ordinary people at ease struck a chord with those on both sides of the political debate. The American people still regard Ronald Reagan as the great communicator, and he continues to be one of the most popular U.S. presidents in history. Britain and the United States maintain a special relationship rooted in common history and shared values.
And every tendency, however natural, which turns our minds or energies from the supreme objective of the general victory of the United Nations, by singleness of purpose, by steadfastness of conduct, by tenacity and endurance, such as we have so far displayed, by these and only by these can we discharge our duty to the future of the world and to the destiny of man.
War hero and Prime Minister Winston Churchill first coined the term special relationship in 1944 to describe the close cooperation between the U.S. and UK during World War II. President Reagan's administration also strived to protect the close ties between Britain and the U.S. Conservative Party leader Margaret Thatcher became the British Prime Minister in 1979, with her premiership continuing until 1990. Dubbed the Iron Lady, Thatcher knew how to stand up to her American counterpart, but also how to work in harmony during the decade's most heated periods.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope.
Reagan and Thatcher's politics were complementary, to say the least. Both parties believed in small government, supply-side economics, and individual freedom. The pair's views on the Cold War also held many similarities. In 1983, Thatcher's government changed tactic and decided to seek out a dialogue with the Soviet Union. Thatcher was Reagan's favorite foreign leader by far, a large part of the reason why she became Gorbachev's most important European partner. And soon, all three leaders were making steps towards a peaceful, negotiated endpoint for the Cold War. The decade threw an array of intense issues at Thatcher and Reagan. In the early 80s, a rare virus began to spread across the United States and soon made its way over the Atlantic to Britain. Thatcher and Reagan now faced an invisible enemy. However, their delayed reaction in devising a battle strategy soon stoked division.
When AIDS hysteria was starting to take over the nation, the U.S. government initially thought that this was a disease that was really only affecting certain groups, that it didn't really prioritize whether it be drug users or homeless people or hemophiliacs or homosexuals or immigrants. They didn't really think it could affect the general population, and when it started to really spread, they started to see that this could really affect all Americans and that it was going to require huge amounts of research.
Originally identified as a gay disease, U.S. and UK society sought to ostracize homosexual males. The disease continued to spread, and diagnosis came with a large dose of prejudice and hate. In the U.S., Reagan had to deal with the Christian rights backlash against homosexual groups, supposedly spreading AIDS. Whereas in the UK, Thatcher faced uproar from the right-wing press, who spread hysteria and relentlessly targeted the gay community.
The one difference, though, was that the campaign of the Thatcher government was more pragmatic. She wasn't saddled with some of the elements of the Christian right that was part of the Republican Party in the U.S. And so she was able to pursue a more effective and pragmatic campaign to encourage her citizens to use contraception and to practice safe sex. And that was something that the more puritanical US public didn't have the same type of campaign.
Soon, both the UK and US governments had to accept that the disease was not just affecting homosexuals, ethnic minorities, and drug users. Thatcher and Reagan had no choice but to fund more research to tackle the epidemic head-on. Ronald Reagan not only formed a strong partnership with Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. The 40th president also bonded with the British royal family, meeting the Windsors on several occasions throughout his presidency. In 1982, Reagan toured Europe, meeting with both NATO and the G7, and addressing the UK House of Parliament. However, despite a busy schedule, Reagan leapt at the chance to visit the Queen and Prince Philip. A first for any U.S. president, the monarch invited Reagan to stay at one of her favorite residences, Windsor Castle. The Queen and Reagan bonded over their love of horses. The pair therefore jumped at the opportunity to venture out on a ride together around the grounds of Windsor. Reagan even persuaded the Queen to pose for photos on the horse, and the press delighted in capturing the two leaders together. At the time of the visit, Margaret Thatcher was preparing to send troops into the Falklands to defend the British territory against Argentina. The atmosphere in British government was tense, and Thatcher desperately needed Reagan's support. There were rumors that Reagan's horse ride with the Queen secured the U.S.'s backing.
Britain is not prepared to be pushed around. We have ceased to be a nation in retreat.
Reagan wrote in his diary that the magical trip to Windsor was a fairy tale experience and the highlight of his European tour. To return the favor, the Reagans invited the monarch to their Californian ranch in 1983. The Queen and Prince Philip arrived in Santa Barbara during a ferocious storm. The journey was hazardous, and yet Her Majesty's press secretary later said that she found the trip delightful and terribly exciting. However, the royal couple did not just stop there. The Queen and Prince Philip continued on to tour the West Coast, with stops in San Diego, Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, Yosemite, and many more cities and sites. In San Francisco, Her Majesty toured the bay on board the royal yacht Britannia, inviting the Reagans for dinner on the floating palace. The most important event, however, took place at the M.H. de Young Memorial Museum in Golden Gate Park. Around 260 guests were invited to one of the fanciest dinners in San Francisco's history.
From time to time, friendships must be publicly reaffirmed. My visit has given me the opportunity to reaffirm the ideals which we share and the affection that exists between our people, without which the formalities of alliance would be meaningless, but from the certainty of which our two countries continue to draw strength. Mr. President, I raise my glass to you and to Mrs. Reagan, to the friendship between our two countries, to the people of California, and to the people of the United States. President.
President.
In 1985, it was the younger generation's turn to greet the 40th president and the First Lady. The Prince and Princess of Wales made a stop in Washington after a 10-day tour of Australia. And, despite the jet lag, the occasion turned out to be one of the most famous evenings at the White House ever. The Reagans and Wales were joined by a multitude of famous faces, from Tom Selleck and Clint Eastwood to David Hockney and Neil Diamond. At the time, Diana was becoming one of the most famous faces in the world, and the star-studded list of invitees confirmed her popularity.
Mr. President, Mrs. Reagan, ladies and gentlemen, if I may say so, Mr. President, you really have touched both my wife and myself most deeply this evening by your extremely kind words. And we can't possibly, both of us, thank you enough for your immense hospitality and your great kindness in having us here this evening and in making us feel so unbelievably welcome.
However, the party did not stop after dessert. The royal couple and the Reagans moved to the dance floor with their guests to continue the celebrations. Reagan even managed to catch the young Diana for a dance, while the Marine Band played a collection of tunes. The unforgettable moment of the visit came at midnight. Diana had earlier announced to Nancy Reagan how much a fan she was of the actor John Travolta. The First Lady kept the thought in mind and later sneakily persuaded John Travolta to ask the young princess for a dance. The photograph of the moment has since been locked in the Pop Culture Hall of Fame. The Queen confirmed her admiration for and gratefulness to the leader with an honorary knighthood, the highest honor Britain can give a foreigner, and a special thanks to the President for his support during the Falklands War.
Mr. Reagan, how do you feel to receive this honor?
What's that?
How do you feel to receive this honor?
I feel greatly honored. I can't tell you how appreciative and how proud I am of this honor that we got.
Ronald Reagan quickly became one of the royal family's most favorite presidents to have ever passed through the White House doors. The 40th president left behind a mixed legacy. Debates on his presidency still continue between historians and critics 40 years later.
So the legacy that Reagan left behind really depends on who you're asking. So today, he's very popular. You have 75% of Americans that view him fondly. When he left office, he had an approval rating of 53%. But in the end, he moved the party to the right. It became more conservative with a capital C. It was more in favor of extreme policies that have shifted actually American political culture as well.
But maybe you and I have done better than we know, those of us who talk of conservatism. Because the great majority of the people today believe with us. They may not be able to put a label on it, but their approach to the various policies of government is the same as ours.
Reagan achieved great success with foreign policy. He built strong relationships with foreign leaders and pushed further than any president before him for negotiations with the Soviet Union. Less than a year after leaving office, the Berlin Wall finally fell, and Germany became united once again.
And through another hole, another East German warlord takes advantage of the new liberties. After all, it's New Year's Eve. Anything goes tonight. Bits of the wall are still being chipped out as souvenirs. It's not easy. For the young, the Spartans are the attraction. They'll just know when they're much older that they were here for this historic moment.
However, his radical Reaganomics plan altered America forever and left much to be desired when it came to equality and tackling poverty.
We see that historians feel that his Reaganomics policies didn't work, and you saw that in addition to a pervasive homelessness problem, pervasive problems in urban areas that have never really recovered, we had huge increases in income inequality. The U.S. became the most unequal industrialized nation in the world.
As a former actor and big personality, the election of Reagan also changed the political system in America. His policies and persona pushed American politics further to the right and made a gateway for future celebrity presidents like Donald Trump.
We'll make America great again. Thank you.
After life at the White House, Ronald and Nancy Reagan returned to California and retired to his home in Bel Air, Los Angeles. Up until contracting Alzheimer's, Reagan spent his time writing memoirs, creating the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, and riding horses at his ranch. In 1994, Reagan decided to publicly announce his diagnosis with Alzheimer's to help raise awareness of the illness. He largely disappeared from public view as the disease progressed, and in 2005, the news of his death hit international headlines. Queen Elizabeth II led some of the early tributes to Reagan, and the then Prince Charles attended the funeral on the monarch's behalf. Former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and Soviet Union leader Mikhail Gorbachev also attended, paying their respects to a once great ally and close friend in the political world. Ronald Reagan's passing saddened not only the American public, but people across the world. The Windsors had stayed in contact with the Reagans until the end of his life, showing the closeness and warmth between the two families. The death of the 40th U.S. president once again confirmed the enormity of Queen Elizabeth II's reign. Ronald Reagan's promotion of individual freedom guided America down a new path, and one which would change the political system forever. His infamous Reaganomics failed to reach high success levels. However, Reagan's actions during the Cold War helped push back the Soviet Union, save millions of lives and European countries from division, and ultimately alter the course of the world.
We seek neither confrontation nor conflict, but to avoid both, we must remain strong and determined to protect our interests.
His foreign policy achievements, therefore, cannot be underestimated. Whatever the history books might say about Ronald Reagan, he will certainly go down as one of the most memorable and iconic presidents in American politics.